Bob Allison, step forward, Bob, be recognized, earned his Ph.D. in history from Harvard. He teaches American history, constitutional history, cultural contact in world history, and the history of Boston. He is the author of The Crescent Observed, The United States and the Muslim World, 1776 to 1815, and A Short History of Boston. He has edited several books, including the interesting narrative of Alauda Aquino, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, several volumes of the award-winning American Eras series, including the Revolutionary Era, 1754 to 1783, and the Development of a Nation, 1783 to 1815. He also edited 2 volumes of 20th century American political and social history, History and Dispute, The Pursuit of Progress, 1900 to 1945, and The Pursuit of Liberty, 1945 to 2000. He's involved with several museums and historical societies in Boston. He's been actively involved with the Boston History Collaborative, developing Boston by the Sea, a maritime trail featuring both land and water-based tours of Boston's maritime history. He's delivered public lectures at the Bostonian Society, Adams National Historic Site, and has presented papers at conferences in the U.S., Wales, and Turkey. He's an elected life member of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts and a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. But I must say his crowning achievement is delivering the first Boston Navy Week lecture, for which we're appreciative. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Bob Allison. Thank
you. Well, thank you. And I think we also should recognize Lieutenant Preble, who organized the Navy Week activities and has done so far a terrific job. We were talking actually before the formal festivities started about the footage that exists from the Second World War, amazing scenes of battle, the landings, Normandy, and the wars I'll be talking about don't have any footage, and they don't really exist in the public mind or in the historical mind, the imagery, the way that these more recent conflicts have. But they do survive. There were ways of conveying this story. A friend of mine sent me this newspaper clipping from a New London newspaper in December of 1812. It has a wonderful figure of an angel trumpeting good news, and I'll just read you this briefly. Another brilliant naval victory. After our paper had been put to press, a courier arrived, express from New London, with the following handbill announcing the capture of the British frigate Macedonian by Commodore Decatur in the United States, and her safe arrival with a prize off Montauk Point. And one thing that people in the early 19th century would do that I think our era does not is almost immediately come up with a poem celebrating the achievement. And this one concludes, and mark amid the splendid hand that guards Columbia's boundless strand, that hero of the wave, Decatur, bravest of the brave. Now, I have to confess, being now confronted with so many Navy people, that I am a lifelong civilian so far, and I came to the study of Decatur after writing a book on the Barbary Wars. The History Channel did a show on the Barbary Wars about 8 years ago or so, and the day after I went to drop off my kids at school, and the 8th grade teacher, who was both a sailor and also a great lover of history, said, Stephen Decatur sounds like an interesting guy. Is there a good book about him? And it occurred to me that at that point, the last biography of Decatur had been written in the 1930s. So, lifelong civilian that I am, I also have great faith in my own capabilities. I thought, well, no one's written a biography of Decatur in about 46, 50 years. I should do it. So I did. I set out to write a book about Stephen Decatur. And I knew a couple of things about him from having the book on the Barbary Wars. I knew that he was, at the age of 25 in a few weeks, the youngest man ever commissioned a captain in the United States Navy. That was in 1804. He was commissioned a captain. He was at that point the youngest man ever to be a captain, and he still is the youngest ever to be a captain. And he was commissioned a captain for an extraordinary event. The United States and Tripoli were at war in the first decade of the 19th century, and there were two American frigates patrolling the Mediterranean or maintaining a blockade of Tripoli, as the Jefferson administration wanted to coerce Tripoli through an economic blockade into not capturing American merchant ships. The second largest of these ships was the Philadelphia. The first was the USS Constitution, which had just arrived in the Mediterranean in the fall of 1803, when the Philadelphia ran aground off Tripoli. This was a major strategic blow to the idea of a blockade. You lose half of your force. The ship then was taken into Tripoli harbor and was being outfitted by Tripoli. The story at the time was Tripoli was going to use it against the United States. Actually, Tripoli was going to sell the ship to Tunis, but no one in the United States Navy knew that. So Decatur was at this point a lieutenant aboard the Constitution. Commodore Edward Preble, commander of the squadron, and someone, it may have been Decatur, it may have been Preble, or it may have been Charles Stewart. Can you cast any light on this? Whose idea it was to destroy the Philadelphia? Yes. That's essentially the story, that these three men... Yes. Yeah. And William Bainbridge, who was the commander of the Philadelphia, was in prison in Tripoli, also thought someone should destroy the ship. He was writing this in his letters to Preble, which didn't get through at the time. Preble, Decatur, Stewart all realized the thing to do was destroy this ship. Then how to do it? The ship is in Tripoli harbor. The United States, as I said, now has one frigate and a few smaller vessels. The Philadelphia has about 40 guns on it, and every gun in Tripoli's Navy, about 100 or so guns, and all of the guns in Tripoli's shore batteries are trained on this ship. Decatur took a small vessel, disguised it as a Tripolitan merchant ship or a Mediterranean merchant ship. Captain Stewart, about whom we'll be hearing tomorrow evening, accompanied him with another small vessel. They went to Tripoli, and on the night of February 17th of 1804, Decatur went into Tripoli harbor. He and his men overpowered the crew aboard the Philadelphia. They set the ship afire. They all got back onto their vessel and got away. Once the Philadelphia started to burn, the batteries of Tripoli began firing both on the ship and then on the escaping crew. Decatur and his men got away as they watched the burning hulk of the Philadelphia, a great smoke cloud rising over Tripoli harbor. And the next morning, when they were 40 miles to sea, they could still see the flames of Philadelphia. It was an extraordinary event, as Decatur took what had been a military disaster for the United States and turned it into regarded as the boldest act of the age. And as I said, he returned to Syracuse, where the American squadron was stationed, and Preble immediately wrote to President Jefferson recommending that Decatur be promoted to captain. And Preble immediately began treating Decatur as a captain, as a way of encouraging other young sailors to have the same ambition and the same dauntless courage. So I knew about this story, which is an exciting story and a great story, and it should live on in naval lore and in American historical lore. And I also knew a few other things. For example, during the War of 1812, there was the episode that I mentioned with the capture of the Macedonian off of the coast of Africa. This wasn't the first American victory of the war. Actually, in the first year, there were few American victories in the war, so we needed to celebrate what we could. But what was really extraordinary about the capture of the Macedonian in December of 1812 was that Decatur captured this ship off the coast of Africa and brought it back to the United States. The British captain, who had been defeated by Decatur, thought that this was madness. The British controlled the seas. they were going to encounter the British fleet somewhere, and the Macedonian would be liberated, and Decatur's ship would be captured. But it didn't happen. Instead, on New Year's Day of 1813, Decatur had the Macedonian brought into New York Harbor, an extraordinary event. It became a great tourist attraction as people came to see the Macedonian. But before that happened, Decatur had sent word to Washington about the capture of the Macedonian. He immediately, on arriving on the coast of Connecticut, dispatched one of his lieutenants to Washington with the news of the capture, and rumors preceded Lieutenant Hamilton. The story is that afternoon in Washington, people were preparing for a great naval celebration. There were a number of American naval heroes in Washington: Isaac Hull, the captain of the Constitution, who had defeated the Guerriere, Captain Charles Morris, Captain Charles Stewart, Jacob Jones, and there's a big celebration scheduled that night at a Washington hotel. And all of Washington society had turned out to celebrate the naval heroes. Rumors spread through Washington as folks were preparing for this event that Decatur had captured the Macedonian. In those days, to celebrate a naval victory, people would illuminate their windows. Candles are relatively expensive. You don't light your windows all the time. For special events, you do. So people put lights in their windows to show they were celebrating, and then there was no confirmation of this rumor. So people felt a little foolish, a little down, but they were going to a party anyway to celebrate real victories of Hull and Morris, Stewart and Jacob Jones. And so they put aside their temporary disappointment and went off to celebrate. And they were having a grand time. A band was playing, people were dancing. Suddenly at 9 o'clock, the band stopped. And the doors opened at the end of the ballroom, and there stood Lieutenant Archibald Hamilton with the flag of the Macedonian. The other captains, Hull, Morris, Stewart, and Jones, carried Hamilton across the floor to his parents. Decatur knew which lieutenant to send when he got home to Connecticut. Archibald Hamilton's father was the Secretary of the Navy. Archibald Hamilton was brought to his mother and his sisters, who hadn't seen him in about a year or so. And then the other captains took the flag of the Macedonian and, carrying it like a tent, paraded around the room as the band played, and they brought it to Dolly Madison, the wife of the president, and laid the flag at her feet. Some people thought that this was a little too much. One New York congressman said he couldn't sleep that night. He said he felt like the Grecians looking at the trophies that Athens had won from Sparta. He said he couldn't sleep. So these kinds of events, the naval victories, the heroism, and then the great public effusions, the public love of these guys, is really what captivated me in this study of Decatur. But as I said, I'm a civilian, I'm a college professor, and I don't want to say that historians don't always like to write about exciting things, but I thought there must be something more to this to carry the story between the points where you have great episodes of naval heroism. Otherwise, why is somebody going to read the whole book? You'll just skip over and say, okay, what chapter are we going to have a great sea battle? The more I found about Stephen Decatur, the more I was interested, the more I was intrigued, and actually the more I admired him. And I learned a great deal in the course of writing the book, and I still continue to learn as I meet people who know more about Decatur, more about the Navy than I do, and I expect I'll learn more tonight from the assembly gathered here. Decatur's first command was actually in Boston. He was born in Philadelphia, and you can read the book to find out. Some of you may know more about Decatur's background than I do, but his first command was in Boston in 1803. He was sent here to build a ship, the brig Argus, and here his real naval education began. Captain Edward Preble was already in Boston refitting the USS Constitution, and under Preble, Decatur really learned how to be a sailor, how to be an officer. It was an education that had begun in one way under his father and then continued in the 1790s under John Barry, but it's really under Preble that Decatur and the other sailors become the fighting force that win the War of 1812. So here he built the Argus, sailed it to the Mediterranean once again along with Preble, and arrived there in 1803, just as the Philadelphia was being taken. So this education was an interesting one, but I also discovered Decatur was interested in education in the way we know of it. As a young boy and a young man in Philadelphia, he hadn't had much time for school. Well, he had had time for school. He hadn't had an interest in schooling. He had gone to school with Charles Stewart and others, but apparently Stephen Decatur spent most of his time when he should have been studying across the street in a Quaker burying ground in fistfights with bullies, I am told, or with others who did something wrong, and he spent a lot of time swimming and sailing on the Delaware River and didn't really focus much on learning the way Stewart did or other classmates did. Suddenly, at the age of 25, he is a captain in the Navy, and captains needed to write to the Secretary of the Navy. They needed to associate with people who did have an education, and suddenly he felt a great lack. That is, he now had to deal every day with people who did know things that he didn't. He happened to be home in 1806. His family, as I said, lived outside Philadelphia, and the family doctor came to call. The family doctor was Benjamin Rush, one of the great characters of the early republic. Rush was a friend of Washington and Franklin and Jefferson and Adams, one of the great men of letters of the early republic. And Decatur took him aside and asked Dr. Rush, "What books should I read to become a better educated person?" He said, "When I was younger, I didn't pay any attention to schooling, and now I realize I'm really quite deficient." Remember, this is at a time when Decatur is a captain. He's also being celebrated as one of the heroes of the Tripolitan War, yet he's conscious of the fact that he doesn't quite measure up intellectually to others around him. Now, we know about this episode because Rush was so impressed he wrote it down. I suppose if anyone ever asked me what books they should read, I'd probably remember it too. It hasn't happened yet. So he not only asked Rush for advice, he then followed through on it and did read the books that Rush had suggested. There's a similar episode in 1816 when Decatur moves to Washington at the end of the War of 1812 to become the one of the naval commissioners. Now, he's not commanding men on a ship or organizing a squadron. Now he is supposed to be running the Navy, and being a naval commissioner really was a political position. He had to deal with secretaries of the Navy, with members of Congress, as well as with others. And he realized he didn't quite understand how the American political system worked. And fortunately for Decatur, he was once again able to find someone who could teach him, and the person he found was James Madison. And Madison not only was President of the United States, happened to be living in a house next door to Decatur's, because the White House, as you probably know, had been burned during the War of 1812. He was living next door. He was not only the president, he had for 25 years or more been a politician, and he also was one of the architects of the Constitution. And here young Decatur, now in his 30s, asks Madison if he can explain how the American political system works. There really isn't anyone better to ask a question like this. Madison gave Decatur a copy of The Federalist and marked in it which essays he had written, which Hamilton had written, and which Jay had written. And the reason we know which ones Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote is because James Madison explained to Stephen Decatur which was which. So here in 1816, he has James Madison explaining to him the workings of the American political system. Fascinating tutorship. And I discovered that Decatur did have a great capacity for friendship, or for finding folks who would be willing to talk to him. And amazing number of people were in Decatur's circle. You know, you expect when you're writing about naval heroes, perhaps I expected as a lifelong civilian, that they would mainly associate with other naval folks. But this wasn't the case. What really struck me about Decatur's story, and what really kept me going as I was doing the research and beginning the writing, was on the day that Decatur died, John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State, was on his way to the State Department. He heard that Decatur had been shot in a duel, and Adams immediately went to Decatur's home. And Adams was genuinely distraught over the death of Decatur. And if you know anything about John Quincy Adams, you know he didn't have a lot of close friends. He wasn't a warm person. And the fact that he was so moved at the falling of Decatur said something about the character of Stephen Decatur, perhaps as much as it says about the character of John Quincy Adams. And another friend of Decatur's, I'll just mention briefly, was Richard Rush, the son of Benjamin Rush. Richard Rush had attended to his education when they were both in the same school in Philadelphia, and by 1816 had become Attorney General of the United States and really was one of the most distinguished men of the 19th century. Rush remembered years later that in these months in Washington, Rush had been appointed ambassador to England. He didn't have a place to live in Washington. His family wasn't in Washington. He would have dinner practically every night with the Decaturs. Sometimes in a party, the Decaturs loved to entertain in the home they built in Washington. Other times just the three of them, Richard Rush, Stephen Decatur, and Mrs. Decatur. There's another story about Rush being appointed ambassador to England, and he gets to Annapolis, from which he is supposed to sail off, and Rush didn't understand that the Navy would carry him to England, but expected him to feed himself on the way over. The Navy wasn't going to feed ambassadors who were simply passengers aboard the ship. I don't know if this is still the case, that if the Navy is carrying an ambassador, they're not going to provide for him. Do you know? We'll provide them. This wasn't the case in 1818. So Rush realized he would not only have to pay for his passage on this naval ship, was going to expend all of the money he had, so when he got to England, he wouldn't be able to rent a place to live. And this wouldn't be an auspicious way for an American ambassador to begin his career, by being homeless in London. So Rush didn't know quite what he should do. He could write to the president, but it really wouldn't instill a great deal of faith on the president's part that this guy would be a good ambassador if he couldn't even get himself over to England. So Rush wrote to Secretary of State Adams saying, "What should I do?" And Adams said, well, there are two things we could do. One, the State Department can issue a requisition and send the requisition over to the Navy, and then the Navy can draw down our account, rather cumbersome and complicated bureaucratic transaction. He said, or we can send Captain Decatur to Annapolis, and he can use his negotiating skills to resolve this dispute, which Decatur did. Don't know exactly how Rush got to England, but he didn't have to pay his own way. Maybe I shouldn't tell the Navy folks that. They'll be after the Rush descendants to make up this. The interest at this point would be extraordinary. Now, another friend of Decatur's, and one that really surprised me, was Washington Irving. Irving was a Federalist, where Irving was really the great first American novelist. In fact, Irving set out to become the first professional American writer of fiction. During the War of 1812, Susan Decatur, Decatur's wife, lived in a boarding house in New York while her husband was bottled up in New London, Connecticut, and Washington Irving lived in the same boarding house. Washington Irving thought the War of 1812 was a great mistake. He thought the Tripolitan War had been a great mistake. He had very little use for the Jefferson administration or for the Madison administration. And here he is living in the same boarding house with the wife of Commodore Decatur, who would visit periodically. And when Decatur was in New York, Irving and the Decaturs would spend long evenings together playing cards. In 1813, Irving was helping start one of the first American magazines, and it was thought to be a good idea to give portraits of the naval heroes, and Irving wrote the biographical sketch of Stephen Decatur. Really, the first biography we have of Decatur was written anonymously by Washington Irving. Irving, after the war, wanted to go to England. Decatur at this time was preparing to go to the Mediterranean. Decatur wanted to bring Irving along. He wouldn't have charged him the way the Navy would have charged Richard Rush, because Irving was an old friend and Decatur could do these things that a different captain wouldn't. Irving doesn't go with Decatur to Europe. He goes on his own. Then when Decatur is a naval commissioner, he wants to hire Irving to be the secretary to the Board of Naval Commissioners. It involved ousting the guy who was the secretary, but Decatur told Irving, on your salary in Washington, you'll be able to live like a prince. You won't have to work full-time, so you'll have plenty of time to write. Apparently in those days, the civilians who worked for the Navy really didn't have to do a lot of work. Is that still true? Okay. You think there's going to be a line of folks coming to help out. So here's a friendship that rather surprised me between one of the great men of letters, opponent of the Jefferson and Madison administrations, who comes to like Stephen Decatur as a personal friend and to write the first celebratory articles about him. Another story about Irving I should just tell you briefly. In 1814, Irving is on a steamboat between New York and Albany. As I said, he thought the administration had bungled the war. And in the darkness on this night in September, someone comes aboard with news that the British had burned Washington. And other folks on the ship had an equally low opinion of the Madison administration and its competence. And one voice in the darkness said, well, Jemmy Madison's going to need a faster horse now, as Madison had been forced out into the Virginia countryside to find his cabinet. Irving would have shared that sentiment the day before, but once he heard that Washington had been attacked, he was outraged. And he told this guy off. He said, it's not a question of Jemmy Madison or Johnny Armstrong, the Secretary of the Army. It's a question of the United States. The country has been attacked, and Irving immediately signed up to help in the war effort, which he did. It's probably something that would not have happened had he not befriended Stephen Decatur. Okay. You could not call Robert Fulton a friend of Stephen Decatur's, but he certainly had a relationship with Decatur that is an important one for the history of the Navy subsequently. This is something that the 19th century biographies of Decatur really didn't dwell upon. I don't believe they mentioned it at all, nor did those of the early 20th century. Robert Fulton was a guy that people didn't have neutral feelings about. Do we all know who Robert Fulton was? Could anyone other than Mr. Rudger tell me what he's noted for? Yes. The steamboat, yes. Robert Fulton developed the first practical steamboat. That's what we know him for. But that really wasn't his first interest. The thing that really engaged Robert Fulton's attention, his passion, was actually not making ships go through the water, it was blowing them up. He had gone off to France in the late 1790s as Napoleon was preparing to fight the British Empire. The British had a big fleet, the French had a smaller fleet. If you're fighting against a power with a bigger fleet, you want to neutralize the bigger fleet. I'm just giving this as an abstract idea. I'm not saying that this is something you all should go out and do. But the French wanted to neutralize the British fleet, and here was Robert Fulton, who was thinking of ways to blow up ships. And he developed what he would call, or was then called, a torpedo. We now would call it a mine, a stationary explosive that if a ship hits, it will blow the ship up. So Napoleon had hired Fulton for this, and there was Robert Fulton off in France in the first years of the 19th century, when Robert Livingston came over to negotiate the purchase of Louisiana. Livingston was interested in steam navigation. His brother-in-law, Edward Stevens, in New Jersey, was developing steam engines, and the big problem with putting a steam engine on a boat or a ship that's made of wood, steam power requires a fire. You can see where this is going. All kinds of problems with developing a steam engine that will work to propel a ship. But Fulton was a mechanical guy. He's someone who could think how to solve problems like this. So the Livingston actually hired Fulton away from Napoleon and brought him to New York, where he did, by 1807, develop the first really successful steamboat. But he didn't give up his real passion, his interest in blowing up ships, in torpedoes. And in 1811, he wrote a book called Torpedo Warfare, that explained how torpedoes really were the future of naval warfare. And he sent a copy to former President Jefferson, who also liked imaginative people with new ideas. And Jefferson thought that this was great. Torpedoes. Maybe next year during Naval Week we can talk about Jefferson and the Navy. But Jefferson became Fulton's chief promoter. And because of Jefferson's prodding and constant lobbying, the Navy agreed to give Fulton's torpedoes a tryout. The trials were held in New York, and Captain John Rogers oversaw the trials. Now, as I said, people weren't neutral about Fulton. Thomas Jefferson thought Robert Fulton was a genius. Robert Livingston thought Fulton was a genius. John Rogers thought that Robert Fulton was a madman. You were either on one side or the other when it came to Robert Fulton. I don't know if anyone here has strong opinions one way or another, or if anyone's a Fulton descendant who wants to speak up. But Rogers thought that Fulton was a madman, and Rogers and Isaac Chauncey developed ways to protect ships against torpedoes. Okay, if you have to wait for the ship to hit it, what you do is you put a big net around the hull of the ship that pushes the torpedo away, and it goes and explodes somewhere else. So the trials for the torpedo in 1811 in New York Harbor were a disaster for Robert Fulton. The Navy came up with effective ways of dealing with this problem. So Fulton had said this is the future of naval warfare, and John Rogers proved that it wasn't. Now, Fulton wasn't a guy who simply took a defeat or a setback like this and gave up. He thought there has to be a way to get through the ship's defenses. The only captain in the Navy who would listen to Fulton and thought that his ideas had some merit was Decatur. And Fulton and Decatur, actually Fulton really worked out a way to, it's kind of an interesting thing he did. He needs to find a way to cut through the nets that they've put around the hull of the ship. So at first he thought maybe you could have big machetes under the hull of the ship that will cut the nets. No, that really wouldn't work. You need some way of propelling a sharp thing through the netting to cut it, so then the mine can get there. Well, if you can propel the sharp thing, why not just propel the mine at the hull of the ship? So Fulton developed an underwater cannon that could shoot through the netting and could hit the hull of the ship and destroy it. And he and Decatur began working out a way to create a vessel that could carry an underwater cannon close enough to an enemy ship so that they could actually shoot this cannon that didn't have a long range underwater. And they did. And they began developing the first steam-powered war vessel in the history of the world. A naval vessel. The first one was called the Demologos, then was changed to Fulton I, had a steam engine to power it, and it had to be able to get close enough to the enemy ship to shoot a torpedo at it. Now, the problem is, in those days, the ships operated, or naval warfare, was mainly carried on through boarding, hand-to-hand combat. You get close enough to the enemy ship to get aboard and disable the crew. If this ship gets close enough to the enemy ship, all they need to do is get aboard it and take it over. Fulton kept trying to think of ways of making the deck impossible for enemy sailors to get aboard, and I believe it was Decatur's idea to make the deck slope so sharply no one could get a foothold on it. So what emerges from these periods of discussions between Decatur and Fulton is a prototype for ultimately a vessel that will have a very sharply sloping deck, an engine inside it, an underwater cannon. It was a big, cumbersome thing that they finally built in 1815, but in many ways you can see this as the future of naval warfare. Cumbersome, metal-encased vessels with an engine inside and the ability to cut through an enemy ship's defenses. Now, this raises the question for me, as I'm looking at all of this stuff on Decatur and Fulton, what an extraordinary development this is. How come no one noticed this? Other biographers of Decatur, and I'm not here simply to castigate other people who have written very good books about Decatur for missing something, because I know inevitably we all miss things. I thought, well, in the 19th century, when the first biographies were written, nobody understood, very few people understood that ultimately torpedoes, as we now know, would change the nature of naval warfare. And I suppose in the 1930s, when the most recent biographies were being written, torpedoes still were things used by other folks, the Germans in World War I, that gave them a bad name. Now, I suppose if I were a more philosophical person, I would have something to tell you about weapons, being a neutral thing. But here, they do revolutionize naval warfare. Ultimately, they revolutionized it. It doesn't happen in 1815. Had the war gone on, perhaps it would have. Another thing that I didn't know about Decatur, and that still interests me about him, wasn't something that he did, but something that he said. There was another tradition after a war or during a war, and during any kind of event. If we were having a gathering like this, it usually would end with all of us offering toasts. And the toasts would be printed in the newspapers. So we would say the Navy Week gathering was held, and each of us toasted the President, the Secretary of the Navy, the Congress, other political institutions. And this was kind of a formality. Now, as a naval hero, after the Tripolitan War and then after the War of 1812, Decatur and the other captains were called upon to attend testimonial dinners in their honor and to offer an appropriate toast. They would be toasted, someone would say, Captain Decatur, and then everyone would raise their glass, and then the person proposing the toast would explain why they were toasting Captain Decatur, because he is brave and chivalrous or something, equally fitting. And then the toasts would be published in the newspapers, and then other people would have testimonial dinners and give the same toasts. I don't suppose this is something folks do anymore. Do they, Paul? Okay, good. See, I haven't moved in the right circles. I've not been invited to any of these ceremonies. I don't know if the likelihood is that I will be, but I'm glad to know that they do happen. Now, after the Tripolitan War, Decatur was at a testimonial dinner in Philadelphia. His father had been a privateer captain in the Revolutionary War and then had been in the Navy in the 1790s. One brother, his brother James, had died in Tripoli. Decatur had become perhaps the greatest hero of the Tripolitan War. Another brother-in-law had died in the Mediterranean in a duel. And his younger brother John was also in the Navy. So at this testimonial dinner in Philadelphia were seated the senior Captain Decatur, his son Stephen on one side, his son John on the other. And the toasts went around, and the senior Decatur was a man of few words. The one or two surviving letters from him suggest that he was barely able to read or write. He had been a captain. He had gotten into the merchant service. His father had been a lieutenant in the French Navy, and he had then gone into the business as an iron manufacturer, a cannon and gunpowder manufacturer outside of Philadelphia. And here was a dinner in honor of his son Stephen, his son James, now deceased, and his son John. And everyone else had given a toast, and then all eyes fell on the senior Captain Decatur, who had lost one son and one son-in-law in Tripoli. And the senior Captain Decatur said, "Our children are the property of their country." It was thought to be a great patriotic statement, which it certainly was. Now, Stephen Decatur, as I said, was conscious of his lack of education, conscious of the fact, or what he thought was the fact, that he didn't write very well. Consequently, he said he wouldn't write much. And in 1815, he was attending testimonial dinners as he was going through the Chesapeake Bay area looking for sites for a naval base. And at every dinner, there would be a banner with his father's words, "Our children are the property of their country." It must have occurred to him, or may have occurred to him, that he would never say anything quite as memorable as what his father had. And he would write out often, quite laboriously, an appropriate toast celebrating the people of a community, of Philadelphia, of New York, or of Petersburg, or whatever community was honoring him, Baltimore. In Norfolk, Virginia, in April of 1816, he was at yet another testimonial dinner, and the toast went around, and it was his turn. And he raised his glass, and he said, "Our country." And everyone then would raise their glasses. "In her intercourse with foreign nations, may she always be right, and always successful, right or wrong." This is an extraordinary statement. in the context of the contentious nature of the early republic. When Decatur was a boy in Philadelphia, the United States was at war with France. The Republicans, the party then of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, thought that the French war was an attempt by the Adams administration to attack the one true friend of liberty and the United States, the French Republic. There were riots or fistfights in the streets of Philadelphia. People who were pro-French would wear a certain color cockade in their hat, and those who were against France would attack them and vice versa. Young Stephen Decatur, whose grandfather had been a lieutenant in the French Navy, was one day attacked by a group of pro-French folks for wearing an anti-French cockade, or not showing his pro-French sympathies, which actually didn't exist. The country practically broke up over the war with France, with one political party charging that the other was using this war as a subterfuge to attack liberty. Then during the War of 1812, when Decatur had been defending the United States from the port of New London, Connecticut, the Federalists, the opposite party from the Republicans, had thought that this war was brought on by the bungling and incompetence of this Republican administration of Jefferson and then of Madison. And the citizens of New London, according to Decatur, were for the British and against the American fleet. In fact, he said every time his ships tried to leave the port of New London, someone in New London would flash a blue light to warn the British fleet that the Americans were coming out. So he had seen in his lifetime different wars the country had fought, which were controversial, puts it too mildly, which practically broke the country apart. The Federalists in 1815, 1812, 1813, 1814 charged the Republicans with making war on the British, who were our true friends. In 1798, the Republicans had charged the Federalists with making war on the French, who they believed were the country's true friends. People knew that the country could be wrong, and they were prepared in some cases to allow the country to face defeat rather than have the country succeed. And what Decatur's toast to me seems to be saying is that our country may be right or it may be wrong, but unless the nation is successful, we won't have the opportunity to say so. Actually, at the time he gave the toast, people thought that this was a great statement he had made against the Massachusetts legislature, which was attacking all of the celebrations of the American victory in the War of 1812. Now, I'm not sure if he intended to attack the Massachusetts legislature, which I know it might surprise you to know had anti-war sentiments in 1812. Now, the final thing I'd just like to mention, so we'll have some time for questions, is an encounter Decatur had in 1818 with the other great hero of the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson. Jackson, well, we don't need to talk about Jackson's role in the War of 1812 since this is Navy Week, and the Navy version of it is that the victory at New Orleans had very little impact on the outcome of the war. The war was won by the Navy. The victory at New Orleans was actually after the peace treaty had been concluded. I should tell you, I just spent the first part of the week in Tennessee, and I'm glad to be able to say this publicly now. I wouldn't have been able to come here had I ventured this opinion down there. After the war, Jackson, who was commander of the Southern Department of the American Army, had invaded Spanish Florida and captured Pensacola, a town and trading post and port on the Gulf Coast. Spain controlled Florida. Spain and the United States were at peace. Jackson had invaded Florida, captured Pensacola. In the long term, this may have been a good thing for the United States, and we all know ultimately the United States gets Florida from Spain, but at the moment it seemed to lead the United States into a war with Spain. And the Monroe administration really wasn't happy with this turn of events, that suddenly this general decides he's going to capture Pensacola. And the cabinet had big discussions about what should be done with Jackson. Should he be censured? Should he be court-martialed? Ultimately, the administration decides not to do those things, but the Senate decides to investigate what had happened. And senators, again, well, we don't need to talk too much about senators, just to say that the Senate did issue a report on Jackson's enterprise into Pensacola. And one thing the senators discovered was that Jackson had friends who had invested in real estate in the area around Pensacola. So they don't say this in the report, but the implication is, rather than being an attempt to extend the sphere of the American Republic or seek an advantage for the United States, Jackson's enterprise had simply been an attempt to help some of his friends do well in the real estate market in Pensacola. And Jackson was outraged. Jackson was a man with a temper, you should know, and he didn't take something like this lightly. He vowed that he was going to come to Washington and cut the ears off of the senator who had issued the report. The senator, Senator Abner Laycock of Pennsylvania, was a man in his 70s at the time, and suddenly he hears that Jackson is coming to Washington to cut off his ears. And Senator Laycock got permission from the Marshal of the District of Columbia to start carrying a weapon in case Jackson attacked him. And Jackson did attack other people. So the rumor swirls that Jackson is coming to Washington and he's going to get even with these senators for besmirching his reputation, which incidentally is what they were trying to do. Jackson had ambitions of becoming president, and any negative thing they could say about him was more to the good, or so they thought. So Jackson is coming, and the senators don't quite know what to do about this. The day arrives, actually the rumor spreads the day before, that Jackson is within sight of Washington, and the morning comes when Jackson, in a carriage, approaches the Capitol building. And Jackson gets out of his carriage at the Capitol building, and he strides up to the door of the Capitol to go in and tell these senators what he thinks of the kinds of things they're putting in these reports. And there, standing in the door, is Commodore Decatur. And Jackson tells him, "Step aside, I intend to enter the Senate chamber." And Decatur says, "If you do, General, you will have to pass over my dead body." Now imagine this, these two men who had fought for the Republic in the War of 1812, now facing off in front of the Capitol building. One of them prepared to go in to defend his personal honor, if it meant cutting off the ears of a senator, the other one preventing him, to allow the legislative body to take its course. And Jackson turned around, got back in his carriage, and did not enter the Senate chamber, nor did he cut off the ears of a senator. To me, this may be the most striking event in Decatur's life. The naval heroism, in 1812 and in Tripoli are of course great parts of the foundation of the Navy. But here he is, facing off against another military hero to defend the Constitution and the constitutional branches of government. And to me, that perhaps is the part of his legacy which we all should celebrate the most. Thank you. Now, as promised, if anyone has questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Yes, John. That's an excellent point. And the irony is that Jefferson and Madison had both been leery of creating a Navy because they thought that this might be, it might lead into foreign wars and so on. And here, these naval officers are conscious of the fact that they serve under civilian authority. and that the war is conducted, the policy is made by civilians. There's an episode Decatur is bottled up in New London in 1813, 1814. The British fleet is off the coast. He and his ships are in the Thames River in New London and can't get out. And they do exchange messages. The Americans, as I said, had captured the Macedonian, and the Macedonian sister ship is in the British fleet. And there always was this idea circulating that did the Macedonian lose because the ship wasn't as good as the American ship, or was it because of the crew? So I think this is a great opportunity. We will put an American crew on the Macedonian, the British crew on the British ship, and we'll see which one wins. So these officers in New London and off the coast get this idea for a duel between the two ships. And they exchange a series of messages. And ultimately, Madison hears about this, and he says, no, you can't have duels with British ships, even though it will entertain you. And the Decatur thought this would be a great boost to national morale, never anticipating that his men could lose. But in his exchange with one of the British officers about cooking up this duel, the British officer says, since we are here having to fight this unjust war that your country brought on, and Decatur said, in just a very short answer to this guy, he said, it is not my role to discuss policy. Whether the war is unjust or unjust, I leave to someone else. That is, he was there to fight for the civilian authorities and not to put himself in place of the civilian authorities. And this, after the war, when the the President creates the Board of Naval Commissioners, there is some conflict here about the naval commissioners feel they're supposed to run the Navy. The Secretary of the Navy feels he is supposed to run the Navy. And ultimately, they do resolve this. The Secretary of the Navy is the one who makes policy. But I think probably, in addition to training the sailors, and in 1798 and then in the first decade of the century, men like Barry and Preble really instill it in them that they are serving under civilian authority. A lot of them question the policy of the civilian government, but they do carry out their mission. Jefferson had this idea for gunboats, which all the naval officers thought really weren't very effective. But it's not their position to say, this is really the way you should be fighting a war, this is what we should be doing. So I think that remains one of the core values of the Navy, is the Navy's ability to maintain national interest aside from, political interests or so on. In fact, this is one of the hallmarks of the military as a whole. I don't want to cast unnecessary aspersions on other branches. It's one of the things that I think differentiates the men and women who serve in our military from those who have served in others. You can think of any number of times in the history of the country when those who had the military capability could have simply said, well, why do we need a civilian government? Beginning perhaps in Newburgh, New York in 1783, when some of Washington's officers had this idea of simply creating a more effective government that would pay them. I think that's an excellent point you've raised, and I hope you'll talk about it more tomorrow evening. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned was assassinated.
Yes. Decatur's duel? Yeah, this is, Decatur died in a duel in March of 1820, fought with another naval captain, former naval captain. And it's a long story. I don't know how much time you have. Goes back, I think, to 1807, when the United States Chesapeake was dispatched to the Mediterranean to patrol, to maintain the naval presence in the Mediterranean. The commander in charge of the squadron of which the Chesapeake would be a part was James Barron. And Barron had been in the Tripolitan War. He had been in the Navy since the 1790s. In fact, he had been a lieutenant on the first ship where Stephen Decatur had been a midshipman in the United States in 1798. Barron and Captain Morris didn't anticipate, Morris was in charge of the day-to-day operations of the ship, didn't anticipate any hostile action until they got to the Mediterranean, if then. The British believed that there were British deserters aboard the Chesapeake, which, in fact, I believe there were. And just off the coast of Virginia and Maryland, the British warship Leopard ordered the Chesapeake to stop so that they could come aboard and search for British deserters in the American crew. You know, this was one of the reasons ultimately the United States and England went to war, was this whole question of British deserters serving on American ships. Barron didn't stop immediately. He and his men conferred on what to do. Their ship wasn't prepared to fight. There was still luggage piled on top of the cannon. They hadn't drilled the crew, and the ship itself hadn't been drilled effectively since it had left Washington a few weeks earlier. In fact, it wasn't even able to fire the customary salute when it passed Mount Vernon on its way down the Potomac River. And here it was confronted by a British ship that was prepared to fire, and the Leopard did. And it killed a number of American sailors, and the Chesapeake was not able to fire a shot until actually the flag was being lowered from the mast to signify surrender. At that moment, one of the American lieutenants gets a coal from the stove, brings it to his cannon, and fires one shot at the Leopard. But at that moment, the flag is hitting the rail on the deck. So the Chesapeake is disabled. It's brought back to Norfolk. The British do come aboard, take some men off, and then the ship is allowed to go back to Norfolk. And Decatur is sent to take command of it. President Jefferson realizes what a disaster this is and needs to restore the honor of the Chesapeake, so who better than Stephen Decatur to take command of the ship and put it back in order. And then the Secretary of the Navy asks Decatur to serve on Barron's court-martial, which he does not want to do. He said he had come aboard the ship after the surrender. He thought that Barron had not prepared the ship for any engagement. So he had already formed a judgment of Barron's incompetence. However, the Secretary of the Navy insists that Decatur serve on the court-martial, which he does, and the court-martial winds up suspending Barron for 5 years. Now, during his suspension from the Navy, Barron goes into the merchant service. He has 9 daughters, I think, to support. He has a big family to support. He's been in the Navy now for more than 10 years. This was his career. So he goes into the merchant service, and he happens to be in Europe in 1812, first in 1808, when the United States imposes an embargo on American ports, and then in 1812 when the war breaks out, and he's stuck in Denmark. And he writes to the Secretary of the Navy saying, "My suspension is over now. This is 1813. I'll be happy to come back if you need me." Now, at that time, a letter from Denmark to Washington takes a considerable amount of time to cross the ocean, and then a letter to go back to Denmark. Suffice it to say that the war is over by the time Barron actually comes back to the United States, which he does in, I think, 1817, and he wants to be reinstated in the Navy. His suspension is over. There's no reason for him not to be in the Navy other than every man who had become a captain in the Navy during the War of 1812 would now be under him because he would have seniority. So Barron wants to be reinstated. Decatur says he will never let Barron be reinstated in the Navy. Okay, so this is one part of the story. Barron wants to get reinstated in the Navy, and you can understand why, and we can also understand why Decatur wouldn't want this. Now, what I think is really the interesting part of the story, and I hate to have now gone on for about 20 minutes and then tell you what I think is the interesting part, is the Battle of Lake Erie is really the crucial event here. This battle in 1814, I believe, I should have warned you, in addition to being a civilian, I'm really not good with dates, which kind of is an occupational hazard among historians. Battle of Lake Erie, Oliver Hazard Perry had destroyed the British fleet at Lake Erie and won one of the most decisive battles in all of maritime history. Now, during this battle, one of the great moments is when Perry's ship was shot out from under him. And during the battle, Perry has himself rowed to another ship from which he carries on the battle and defeats the British, sending his great message to the Secretary of the Navy, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." Now, after the battle, when Perry is writing his report, some of the other captains mention the fact that the ship he had gone to was untouched. Captain Jesse Elliott, they said, had held back from the battle and hadn't engaged with the enemy. And they say that's why his ship wasn't touched. You should mention that in your report. There should be a court-martial. A court-martial is an investigation, really. It doesn't necessarily presume the guilt of someone, just to look at what actually happened. And Perry says, no, we're not going to have a court-martial now, because he said it's better to screen screen a coward than let the enemy know we have one. If we start advertising that some of our captains won't fight, well, that would be a disadvantage. So Perry doesn't say anything about Elliott at the time, but then after the war, when these guys now are in the peacetime Navy, Perry wants to do something about Elliott, who apparently other captains didn't really like. Have you gotten that? Okay. I don't want to say anything negative about someone who's a great... Actually, Elliott isn't held in very high regard here. Well, we'll talk about this in a little bit, perhaps. Perry wants to have a court-martial for Elliott, and he provides documentation for what Elliott had done or had not done at the Battle of Lake Erie, and he gives all of this to Stephen Decatur because Perry is off on a voyage to South America. And he says, when I come back from South America, let's look into this, and Perry goes off to South America and dies. Now, Jesse Elliott knows that the person who has all of the evidence about his incompetence at the Battle of Lake Erie is Stephen Decatur. Stephen Decatur can keep Elliott from being in the Navy, and Elliott wants to neutralize Decatur, and he does it through the instrument of James Barron, who's arrived at Norfolk, wants to get back in the Navy, and Elliott starts telling Barron about all the things Decatur is saying about him in Washington. And this provokes Barron into getting Decatur to challenge him to a duel. Elliott tells him, Decatur says, you're a coward, and Barron writes to him, calling a man a coward was grounds for a duel. And Decatur writes back and said, I don't have any recollection of saying you're a coward, even though I think you are. And this long correspondence goes on between these two guys as Barron is trying to get Decatur to challenge him to a duel.